This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shalom Aleichem. How's everybody doing today? We are now up to the 16th malacha. The malacha of Toveh, spinning thread. Malacha number 16. By the way, this will be our last shiur before Shavuos. Next Thursday, there will not be a shiur. Where was spinning used in the Mishkan? Well, once the strands of wool were cleaned and combed and dyed, they could be spun into thread which was continuous. Now, we're going to speak about the Av Malacha, the Tolda, and the D'Rabbanan. There are no Isurei D'Rabbanan on spinning. So the Rambam says if you spin something which is the length of 4 handbreadth, which is usually spun, you're chayev. Whether you spin wool, or linen, or feathers, the Rambam says, or hair, or sinews, you're chayev. Now that should immediately trigger a question. The Rambam says if you just spin sinews, you're chayev. And that's the Av Malacha. If you remember, by combing sinews were not the Av Malacha, it was the Tolda. And the reason being, the Avnei Nezer said that, by the way, I just got today the Sefer HaZikaron of Sachachav, speaking about the Avnei Nezer. They just published the memorial book of Sachachav, the Holocaust memorial book. And the Avnei Nezer said the reason why the Rambam categorizes combing sinews as a tolda is because sinews are not typically combed. Well, they're not typically spun either. Why does the Rambam categorize spinning sinews as the Av Malacha? Okay, we're going to talk about that soon. Then what is the tolda? The Rambam says somebody who makes felt. How do you make felt? Anybody know what's felt? Anybody want to offer some kind of explanation? What is felt? It's a material made out of various particles placed together. It's not really spun or woven, but you make felt from something from which it's possible to spin 4 tvachim long, so that is a tolda of the malacha of Tiviyah. Now the Rambam says, whether you spin wool, or you spin linen, or you spin feathers, or hair, or sinews. So we asked, and this is a question of the Meital, the Sefer Meital, that the Rambam says that combing sinews is not an Av Malacha of combing, it's a Tolda. So why is spinning sinews a Av Malacha of spinning? And the Meital answers that even though sinews are not usually made into thread for spinning, and therefore combing them is not an Av Malacha, but once they're already combed, at that point, it is typical to spin it. In other words, inherently, sinews are not typically spun, but once they're combed, they are. So combing them is a tolda. Spinning them is an av. Now, even if you don't do it with the kli, the Mishnah Berurah says, even if you merely do it with your finger, that is the malacha of Tiviyah. Now we're going to talk about an interesting aspect of spinning. And that is, the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos on Ayin Dalid Amud Beis, that one who shears wool, or somebody who launders wool, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that if you do it while on the animal, you're chayiv 3 karbanos. Number 1 for shearing, 1 for combing, and 1 for spinning. In other words, if you do it while it's still on the animal, if you spin wool while still on the animal, you're chayiv for 3 things. 1, shearing, combing, spinning. So the Gemara asks, Rav Kahana Omar, Ein derech geziza b'kach, ve'ein derech menapetz b'kach, ve'ein derech tziyah b'kach. It is not typical to do any of these activities while the wool is still attached to the sheep. So why you chayiv 3 karbanos? It's not a typical way. So the Gemara says, yes it is. We know in the Mishkan, they washed the wool, and it was spun while still on the goats. And the Gemara basically says, come on, that was an extra special talent they had but under normal circumstances, you do not spin and comb the wool while it's still on the goats. Now, here's the question. Why in the Mishkan did they spin it while it was still on the goat? Why did they comb it while it was still on the goat? What did they do that for? You ever wonder about that? Ooh, big talent. Talent show. Watch the women spin and comb the wool still on the goat. Very exciting. But why'd they do that? That was their biggest attraction, spinning and combing the wool on the goat. So the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos on Daf Sadites says that not all the wool was spun directly on the goats. Only the Yeriyos Izim, only the curtains that were made primarily and only out of the goat hair, the upper curtains were spun while on the goat. The lower curtains of purple wool and crimson and linen were spun after they were off the goat. So the Gemara says like this: Tana Rabbanan, Yeriyos hatachtoinos shel tchel shel garm shel tala ashanim shel sheis. The lower curtains, which were made out of blue, purple, crimson, linen, but the upper ones were Masa Izim. Says the Gemara, Gedoyla Chachma Shenemra Be'elyonos Yosem Shenemra Tachtonos. Greater was the wisdom that was utilized about the upper curtains more than the lower curtains. Because regarding the lower curtains, it says, V'chol Isha Chachma Slave Biyadeha Tavu. Every wise-hearted woman spun with her hands. So by the lower curtains, it says every wise-hearted woman spun with her hands. But by Be'elyonos, it says their hearts elevated them in wisdom; they spun. So in other words, only the upper curtains were actually spun while the wool was still on the sheep. The lower curtains were not spun while the wool was on the sheep. Why is that? Isn't that interesting? I know you were wondering today. Today is what? The 39th of the Omer? So, I know you went to sleep last night. What's going on? Why did they spin the wool only of the upper curtains while on the sheep, not on the lower curtains? Well, the Maskil LeDavid, Rav David Pardo, I had the privilege to be at his kever on Har HaZeisim. He offers as follows, that this was for the sake of nikios, cleanliness. Namely, goat hair remains clean while it's still attached. Once it comes off the goat, then it's subject to becoming sullied through human intervention. So by spinning it while it's still attached, it kept it much cleaner. Now the upper goat hairs, the upper curtains, which were not dyed, they wanted to keep extra clean. So therefore they spun it while it was still on the goat. But the lower curtains, which anyway they dyed and was not subject to becoming sullied because of its color, therefore they were able to spin it after it was off. However, the Sefer Tars HaMalacha gives a different answer based on the Marsha. The Marsha says that the upper curtains of the Mishkan reflect the upper heavens, which was not susceptible to Tumah. Now we know while something's attached to a living being, it's also not susceptible to Tumah. So therefore the upper curtains had to be spun while the hair was still attached to the goat. The lower curtains did not represent the upper heavens, and therefore it could be spun while it was disconnected. Mav Rabbi say, with this yisoid, the Meshech Chochma answers a discrepancy in the diktuk of various psukim in Vayakel. Because it says in Perek Lamed Hey Pasuk Chafei, V'chol isha chachmas leiv biyadeha tavu vayaviu matves. It says V'chol isha chachmas leiv lashon yachid, individual women. That's talking about the lower curtains because it's talking about the curtains that were dyed. And then it says V'chol hanoshim asher nasa liban oisana. It speaks about the women in lashon rabim. Why does it talk about the lower curtains? It talks about the women in lashon yachid, and the upper curtains it talks about the women in lashon rabim. Says the Meshech Chochma very simply, the upper curtains needed to be maintained b'tahara. As the Marsha says, the upper curtains represented the upper heavens, and therefore it needed to be performed with great purity. Therefore, not all women were able to partake. Take two. The lower curtains were spun while they were disattached from the goat. So they're rendered possible, they could be makabel tumah, because they're not attached to the goat. So if they could be makabel tumah, then not all women could be involved in them. Women who are tameh, a woman who is a nida or a zava, cannot be involved in them. Therefore, by the lower curtains, v'chol isha chachma slave, only individual women, not all women, only women who are tahar could be involved in it, because the wool was not attached to the goat. But the upper curtains, they were attached to the goat, so they can't become tameh. If they can't become tameh, all women could be involved in the spinning of that wool. Therefore, it says v'chol hanoshim asher nasa liban lashoin rabim. So this little Meshech Chachma and Marsha, that the upper curtains were twisted and twined while it was still attached to the goat, explains why when it comes to the upper curtains it says all the women, and the lower curtains that it was performed when it was disconnected refers to the only some of the women. Now, these nice sheets bring the Mishnah on Daf Tzadi Down on the base that says that when somebody braids, a woman who braids her hair, or paints her eyes, or applies blush, they are violating a Torah law. However, the Chachamim say it's only midrabanan. Now, what is one violating when one braids their hair? So, Amar Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, it's spinning. You're spinning. You're twisting your hair. You're spinning. It's tviyah. So Gemara asks, is that the derech? So Ravo said, it was explained to me from Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, it's building. So Gemara asks, is that the way to build? Gemara says, yeah. Vayiven Hashem Elokim es hatzela, when God built Chava, the Medrash says, He braided her hair. Now, what do these terms refer to? Toveh. How is there spinning? How is there a havamina? They were spinning in the context of braiding a woman's hair. So Rashi says two different perushim. Rashi says a woman is misaki in her hair, so in between her fingers, she's, so to speak, fixing her hair, twisting it, parting it, stretching it, curling it, and that is considered spinning. Another pshat is, Rashi brings, that it refers to taking dough, making strings out of the dough, and putting the strings on the face to redden the complexion of the face. So you're basically creating strings out of the dough. The Maginei Shloimeh understands that Rashi, what does Rashi mean when he says that it's spinning by fixing the hair? So he says, what it refers to is you're using a comb to separate the hairs that they should not be tangled up. And this is a type of beautification. It's similar to spinning, where you separate a strand from the wool and you twist it to make it into a thread. The Ritva, on the other hand, likes Rashi's second interpretation better, that it refers to, the Ritva says, Umasha yusvurim begamara loimar shi chayeves mishum tviyah because you're making threads out of the dough. Okay, so let's discuss the following practical issue. Are you allowed to braid challah on Shabbos? Say, of course you can't. You can't bake. You can't knead. But let's say on Yom Tif, to make those, I'm not a big challah baker. In case you're wondering, that's not my thing. I like eating the challah, but I don't make the challah. Making those threads of challah to then twist, is the creation of those threads spinning? Or perhaps do we say spinning is not relevant to a food item? What is spinning? What is the malacha? How would you categorize? How would you define the essence of the malacha of spinning? So spinning involves taking multiple threads and spinning them together until they become one thread. So the Rambam, as we learned before, says if you make felt on Shabbos, that's spinning. And as Shakespeare said, wherever there's a Rambam, the Ravid is not far behind. And the Ravid says that actually the Ravid is pretty tame in these comments, so to speak. The Ravid says, in my opinion, I don't recognize spinning as being invoked and making felt. Why not? What do? You're taking combed wool, you're spreading it out on a garment, and you're putting one piece of compressed wool on another piece of compressed wool until it becomes thick. You moisten it, you twine it, you fasten it, and that's felt. But that's not teviyah. He said, I wouldn't call that teviyah. You're just basically compressing together one layer of wool on another layer of wool through moisture, through water. He says, to me, it seems more like making cheese, binyan, which making cheese, megavein is a todah of binyan. And that's the opinion of the Ravid. But the Rambam seems to hold that the essence of the malacha of spinning is taking many items, separate items, and compressing them into one entity. Like threads. You have various strands of threads, and you make one thread and one entity. So the Rambam seems to define that spinning is taking various strands and compressing it, putting it together. And the Rambam extends that to the production of felt. Now, the Gemara says as follows. Amar Rav Zutra bar Tuvia Amar Rav, one who stretches out a sewing thread, you're chayiv for Tuvia. Now, why am I chayiv for Tuvia? I didn't spin it, I didn't produce the thread, I just, so to speak, prepared it, got it ready for being spun. But apparently, spinning applies not only to the production of thread, but any manner of readying the thread for its use is an element of Teviyah. So now what we want to know is there any way that Teviyah could apply to food? Or for example, let's say somebody makes a wick. Is that considered spinning, or is spinning reserved for thread being used for clothing? So the Rambam says an interesting halacha. If you take two ropes and you twist them together, right? You ever see these jump ropes? The very thick ropes? If you take two ropes and you twist it together, the Rambam is of the opinion that that's tying. It's kashira. Wait a second. Why is that not twisting? I mean, think about it. You're taking two ropes and you're twisting it together. You ever see these very thick ropes that they tie ships to the harbor with? I mean, those ropes are made out of other ropes that they just twisted them together. But the Rambam says that's twisting ropes is tying. Twisting ropes is not teviyah. So there are a number of interesting answers here. The Sefer Zachar V'Shamar of Rav Falk says that the definition of spinning is you take multiple items and you mold them together to become a single entity where the individual entities lose their original status. But when you take two ropes and you twist it together, the two ropes still have their own original identity. And therefore that is not twisting, it would be tying. Another possibility, another explanation, is that only when you twist something to be used for a thread for clothing is spinning. Here's the chiddush of the day. There's a possibility that twisting thread together for the production of an item that is not used for clothing may not be teviyah. It could be kashira, it could be tying, but it's not spinning. So the Shevet Halevi, Rav Shmuel Halevi Vosner, wants to utilize this svara in the following context. We know the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman, Taf, Kuf, Yadalet, Siftes, you can't make a wick on Yom Tif. Ein goydlin es apsila, you can't twist the wick, v'loi mehavim, so you can't singe it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why can't you make a wick on Yom Tif? Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're making a kli on Yom Tif. Frek de sharat siyayin, sivkata nun beis. Why do we need to say that the reason why you can't make a wick on Yom Tif is because you're making a kli? Say very simply, the reason you can't make a wick on Yom Tif is because it's twisting. How do you make a wick? You take threads and you twist it together until it becomes one entity. That's how you make it. So why do we have to be busy with, you're making a kli? Forget the kli. You're twisting. It's tviyah. Ask the sharat siyon, v'tzarach iyon, da'amai kamasayim da'avad kli. Why do we have to give the reason that you're making a kli? Tepa kli misham tviyah. It's twisting. Says the sharat siyon, ve'efshir, it could be di misham tviyah l'chod, if it would just be twisting. Halo davka karoi chavasit. Twisting has a very limited parameter that you have to twist the surf 4 tfachim long. But producing a kli has no guideline. Even if you produce the smallest type of kli, you'd be chayiv on Shabbos. So the reason why it's preferable to mention and to deal with the isser of creating a kli is because that is a more overarching rationale, because that would apply even if the shear is less than 4 tvachim. But friends, the Mishnah Berurah clearly implies that spinning is applicable even to non-clothing items. However, comes the Shevet HaLevi, Chelek Aleph, Siman Kuf Aleph, Ois Beis, and he says, only when you spin a strand for clothing is it spinning. But when you twist a strand to make a wick, or you twist a strand to make a rope, that is not spinning. It might be tying, like by a rope, and it might be making a kli, like by a wick, but it's not teviyah. So Alniyas Daiti, says the Shevet HaLevi, Efshir Loimar, it could be. The Inyan Toveh lo shayach ela b'machshir chevel l'shtamish bo b'taras chut. It's only when you prepare a rope, a string, to be used as a thread, the chevel la'arigan, something for weaving, l'tfiru l'kshir keyotzvela. Masha'en kein gidol psila, as opposed to raising a wick, to hurak hachsharas kli lehishtamish by lahadlaka, which is only preparing for lighting. So according to this rationale, the Shevet HaLevi, if one would make those threads of dough for challah on Yom Tif, that would not be tviyah, because tviyah only applies to a clothing item. Now, I will say that we saw in Rashi that one of the definitions of tviyah is to make strings from a doughy substance to pass over your face. And that certainly indicates, not like this svara, that certainly indicates that there is a concept of spinning even by non-clothing items. But it seems like the consensus of the Poskim Halacha is that spinning would not apply to food. Even the Sharat Tzion seems to say it would apply to a wick, but the wick is not long enough. But if you would twist a very long wick, then you could be incurring spinning as well. Okay, Rabbi Sai, thank you very much for joining today and spinning yourself into this time slot and twisting around your whole schedule to join us. And Bez Hashem, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks from now, and wish everybody bracha v'atzlacha and a good Yom Tif. But we have many other shiurim that you could join. And thanks for participating today. Wishing everybody a wonderful Shabbos.
When you mentioned braiding hair, you said that Rashi said one of the explanations was to comb the hairs so that they're not tangled. So it's therefore Rashi saying that when you comb your hair using the soft brush on Shabbos, you also
Yeah, so according to that stage in the Gemara, it seems like there was such a thought. Ultimately, the Gemara falls off of that. In other words, the Gemara says that's not the derech to spin. So, accordingly, in other words, the Gemara did have such a havamina that teviyah would be by combing, but ultimately the Gemara falls off of that. Even, by the way, I didn't read it. Thank you for pointing this out. I actually skimmed over this on page 8, where the Shevet HaLevi says that the Gemara on Daf Sadi Dalid rejects the idea that untangling here is prohibited on account of spinning, and the Gemara brings other possible reasons why braiding hair would be problematic. And accordingly, by the way, the Shevet Levi says that the Rashi, which implied that spinning applies to food items, would not be conclusive because that was only in the Gemara's Havamina. So that's also an important point. In other words, we concluded that Rashi implies that spinning could apply to food items. That was only in the Havamina of the Gemara. But ultimately, it seems like that does not hold true. Okay, everyone. Have a great Shabbos. Kol Tov. Be matzliach. Bye-bye.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.